The sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the towering Williams estate, its tires gliding effortlessly across the smooth red brick driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, a symbol of power, wealth, and dominance, standing tall with its grand white pillars and massive golden gates. Jason Williams sat in the back seat, staring out of the tinted windows as the car came to a slow stop. His heartbeat was steady, but deep inside he knew what awaited him beyond those doors. It had been 15 years. 15 years since he left Nigeria. 15 years since he had escaped his father's suffocating grip. The moment the car door opened, the warm Nigerian air hit him, thick with the scent of fresh earth and distant spices. As he stepped out, adjusting his black designer suit, his eyes swept over the familiar surroundings. The gardens were still pristine, the fountain still elegant, and the estate still as lifeless as he remembered. Just as he was about to grab his luggage, a familiar voice called out, "My son!" Jason turned, and there she was, Mama Grace. She had worked in this house for decades, but to him, she was more than a worker. She was the one who had cared for him since he was a baby, the one who had wiped his tears, the one who had loved him when no one else had. She was older now, her wrinkled face filled with emotion, but her warm smile remained the same. "Look at you. You've grown into such a fine man," she beamed, stepping forward to hug him tightly. Jason smiled, hugging her back. "It's been too long, Mama Grace." "Ah, my dear, too long indeed. But your father—" She lowered her voice, glancing toward the mansion's second floor. "He's seen you. He's watching from his window." Jason's jaw tightened, but he wasn't surprised. His father, Benjamin Williams, never rushed for anyone. He was a stern, calculated man, one whose yes was yes and no was no. A man who was possessive, ruthless in his dealings, and never tolerated disobedience. Jason knew the moment he stepped inside, the real battle would begin. The study was exactly as Jason remembered. Dark, heavy, suffocating. Mahogany walls, towering bookshelves lined with expensive books, and a massive desk that seemed to swallow the room whole. The air smelled of whiskey and expensive cigars. Jason walked in, composed, unbothered. His shirt was slightly unbuttoned, his earrings caught the dim light, his nails perfectly polished, and his high-waisted trousers tailored to perfection. He dressed exactly how he wanted, and he didn't care what anyone thought. Behind the large desk, his father sat, his expression unreadable. He was a powerful-looking man, dressed in a crisp white agbada, his sharp eyes locked onto Jason like a hunter sizing up his prey. 15 years, his father finally spoke, his voice deep, heavy, commanding. "You didn't call, you didn't visit, and now you walk in like nothing happened." Jason smirked, sinking into a leather chair, crossing his legs boldly. "What can I say, Dad? The world is a big place." His father's nostrils flared, but he remained calm. Instead, he picked up a glass of whiskey, took a slow sip, and placed it down with a deliberate thud. "You are 30 now, Jason." Jason sighed dramatically. "Here we go. It's time to settle down. You will marry, you will have children. The Williams name must continue." Jason let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Straight to business, huh? No? How was your flight? No? Did you miss home? Just straight to marriage?" His father's jaw clenched, his fingers tapping against the desk. "This is not a joke, Jason." Jason leaned forward slightly, his voice smooth but firm. "You see, that's the thing, Dad. I don't like women. I'm into men." Silence. A thick, suffocating, deadly silence. Then, crash. The whiskey glass shattered against the floor, the amber liquid spreading across the dark wooden panels. His father shot up from his chair, his entire body shaking with rage. "What did you just say?" Jason remained seated, completely unfazed. "I said," he repeated slowly, deliberately, "I like men, Dad. Women do nothing for me. So this marriage conversation?" Dead on arrival. His father's face contorted in fury, his hands clenching into fists. "Not in my house, never! Never under my roof!" he roared, slamming his hands on the desk. "This nonsense you are saying, it will not happen. Do you hear me? It will not happen. Jason arched an eyebrow, amused. Oh, and what exactly do you plan to do about it? His father's breathing was heavy, but then, suddenly, he stilled. The chief's lips curled into a dangerous, knowing smile. Oh, my dear son, he said, voice low, controlled. Too controlled. You think you have won? You think you can just say whatever you like, and I will accept it? He let out a slow, chilling chuckle, shaking his head. You have no idea who you are dealing with. Jason sat back, watching carefully. His father wasn't a man who accepted defeat, and that cold, calculating smile, it meant the real battle was only just beginning. The club was packed, dimly lit with flashing neon lights that reflected off the glossy floors. The air smelled of expensive liquor, sweat, and desperation. Tonight, the wealthy came to spend without limits, to indulge in their every desire. And Aisha? She came to sell the only thing she had left, her virginity. Her hands were clammy, her stomach twisted in knots, but she had no choice. She had tried everything, begging, borrowing, pleading with doctors, but nothing could cover the mountain of medical bills that suffocated her. And her sister, her sweet, fragile sister, was running out of time. So she stood there in a cheap dress, heart pounding, while men bid on her like she was cattle at an auction. 2 million, 3, 5. Laughter, voices, hungry eyes. She gritted her teeth, keeping her chin up, her body stiff. 7 million, 9. Then, a voice, deep, unshakable. 10 million. Silence fell. Aisha's heart stopped. Every head turned. There, seated in the darkest corner, was him, Chief Benjamin Williams. She had heard of him. Who in Lagos hadn't? A man of power, wealth, and influence. His word was law, his presence commanded silence, and his money had no limit. No one dared to outbid him. She's yours, Chief, the club owner said, a pleased smile on his face. Aisha's knees weakened. It was done. She had just sold herself. She waited in the private suite, sitting on the luxurious bed, her hands clenched in her lap. Her mind raced. Would it hurt? Would he be cruel? Would she regret this for the rest of her life? Her body tensed when the door opened. Chief Williams stepped in, but he didn't move toward her, didn't even look at her the way other men did. Instead, he just assessed her, cold, calculating. Aisha swallowed. Her throat was dry. Come, he finally said, his voice unreadable. Confused, she followed him. Down the private exit, past the intimidating bodyguards, into the waiting black Rolls-Royce. She sat stiffly in the plush leather seat, expecting him to tell the driver to take them to his mansion, a hotel somewhere private. Instead, he sat back, crossed his legs, and finally spoke. Tell me, Aisha, why were you selling yourself tonight? She flinched. How did he? Her fingers curled into fists. I needed the money, she admitted, voice tight. For what? Her breath hitched. My sister, she whispered, her eyes burning. She has seizures. The hospital won't treat her anymore unless I clear the bills. Silence filled the car. Then, good. Aisha's brows furrowed. Good, she repeated. Chief Williams leaned forward slightly. Because now I know you understand desperation, and you know how to make sacrifices. Her stomach twisted. What do you mean? He exhaled slowly, then spoke. The 10 million is yours, no strings attached. She froze. What? He continued. But I have another offer, one that could change your life forever. Aisha stared at him, her heartbeat thudding. I don't understand. His piercing eyes locked onto hers. I don't want you for myself. Aisha's breath hitched. Then, what do you want? A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. I want you to seduce my son. Her lungs stopped working. Your son? Yes, make him fall for you. Make sure he marries you. The air grew thick, the weight of his words suffocating. Why would you ask me to do that? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. His fingers tapped against his golden wristwatch, his expression unreadable. Because he refuses to marry, because he believes he is untouchable, because I need an heir, and he is wasting time. He leaned back, watching her carefully. Do this, and I will give you 30 million naira. That is more money than you will ever make in your lifetime. Aisha's head spun. 30 million? It could change everything. It could get her sister the best treatment. It could end her suffering. But was she willing to trap a man for it? She exhaled shakily. And if he doesn't fall for me? Chief Williams smirked. I don't care what it takes, make him fall for you. And if he doesn't make sure there's no turning back, Aisha shuddered. She understood what that meant. This wasn't a simple deal. This was a dangerous game. One where losing was not an option. Her fingers trembled. She had a choice. But deep down, she knew she had already made it. The next morning, the Williams estate was alive with movement. The golden gates had barely opened when Aisha walked in, clutching her faded black handbag tightly. Her heart thumped wildly against her chest as she stared up at the grand white mansion, its towering pillars making her feel insignificant in comparison. She had barely slept the night before. 30 million naira. It was a number that kept echoing in her head, a price large enough to change her entire existence. But was it worth it? Could she really do this? As she stepped inside the marble-floored foyer, she forced her thoughts away. She had a role to play now. She had barely gotten to the reception area when one of the butlers noticed her. "Who are you looking for?" he asked, his eyes scanning her carefully. I heard there were openings for house staff," Aisha said, keeping her voice measured, polite, but desperate enough to seem convincing. The butler's eyebrow lifted, but he said nothing, gesturing for her to wait. 15 minutes later, she was seated in the grand sitting room, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her handbag. Then, the devil himself arrived. Chief Benjamin Williams walked in, dressed in a flawless white agbada, his piercing gaze locking onto her immediately. She sat up straighter, her body stiff. He didn't speak at first, just studied her, his sharp mind calculating, assessing, judging. Then he smiled. "Looking for a job, are you?" His voice was silk wrapped around steel. Aisha forced herself to nod. "Yes, sir." He leaned forward slightly, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. "Have you worked in a place like this before?" "No, sir," she answered honestly. "Good," he said smoothly. "I prefer fresh faces." Before she could react, he snapped his fingers, calling over the butler. "Take her to Jason's wing. She will be his personal maid." Aisha's stomach dropped. That fast? No interviews? No tests? His cold eyes flickered back to hers, and she knew. This wasn't a hiring process. This was a game, a chessboard, and she was the pawn he had just moved into position. Aisha had been up since 5 a.m., wandering through the massive estate, memorizing hallways, listening to staff talk. She had learned two things very quickly. 1, Jason Williams was a private man. 2, no one ever disturbed him before noon, which is exactly why she stood in his bedroom now, her fingers clenched together, waiting for him to wake up. The room was dark, moody, and masculine, with black walls, heavy curtains, and sleek furniture. The air smelled like expensive cologne, leather, and something uniquely him. She wasn't sure how long she had been standing there when she suddenly heard a groggy groan from the bed. Then, a deep inhale. Then, what the actual hell? Jason bolted upright, eyes wide as he took in the sight before him. Aisha, standing by his bed, her blue eyes shimmering under the soft morning light. For a moment he just stared at her, his breath still heavy with sleep and confusion. Then his voice dropped to a deadly growl. "Who the hell are you?" Aisha almost flinched, but she held her ground. "Your personal maid, sir," she said softly. Jason's brows furrowed. "My what?" "Your personal maid," she repeated, keeping her voice steady, calm, controlled. His jaw clenched. "Since when do I have a personal maid?" "Since today, sir." Jason ran a hand through his messy curls, inhaling sharply. Then realization hit. His father, of course. "Let me guess," Jason muttered, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "My father sent you." Aisha swallowed. Lie or tell the truth? She settled for something in between. "Chief Williams assigned me to you, sir. I am only here to serve." Jason let out a short, cold laugh, rubbing his temple. "Of course he did," he murmured. Then his gaze lifted back to her, and for the first time, he really looked at her. She was beautiful, not in the obvious, over-the-top way, but in a soft, quiet way that snuck up on you. Her blue eyes were striking, her skin smooth, her presence unshakable. Jason frowned. "And what exactly are you supposed to do, Miss Maid?" Aisha forced a small smile. "Cater to your needs, sir." His eyebrows shot up. "My needs?" She nodded, still holding his gaze. "Yes, sir, your needs." Something in her tone made his stomach tighten, but he ignored it. Instead, he stood up, rolling his shoulders back, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. "Tell my father I don't need a maid," he said flatly. Aisha tilted her head slightly, her voice softer this time. "I'm afraid I can't do that, sir." Jason inhaled sharply, annoyance flickering across his face. "Why not?" She simply smiled. "Because Chief Williams assigned me to you personally." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jason exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is going to be a disaster," he muttered. Aisha didn't say it, didn't remind him that she wasn't here by accident, didn't remind herself that this was the beginning of something dangerous. She just stood there, watching him, waiting, because whether Jason liked it or not, she wasn't leaving, and soon enough, neither was he. Jason ran a hand through his messy curls, letting out a slow, exhausted breath. He had woken up to a stranger standing in his room, then had to endure her smug little smiles and persistent presence. And now, he was still dealing with her. He stood up, stretching his arms lazily before walking toward the bathroom, muttering to himself about how absurd this whole situation was. He stopped at the door, glancing back at her, still standing there, still watching him, still not leaving. He arched a brow. "Are you going to be here until I'm done showering?" Aisha's eyes widened, and for the first time since entering his room, she looked genuinely startled. "What? Of course not." She placed a hand over her chest, gasping dramatically. "Unless you need help?" Jason snorted, shaking his head. "Cute, get out." The grand dining hall was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that belonged in an important business meeting, not at a casual breakfast. Jason sat at the far end of the long, polished mahogany table, his plate barely touched, his expression unreadable. Aisha. She had no such issues. Shoes kicked off, chair dragged closer to the table. She was eating like she had just finished a 24-hour fast. Jason raised an eyebrow, watching her scoop an obscene amount of scrambled eggs onto her fork before shoving it into her mouth like she was competing in a food challenge. He couldn't help it. "You do know you're supposed to chew, right?" Aisha paused, blinking at him like he had just spoken another language. Then very deliberately, she picked up a slice of toast, took a giant bite, and chewed at turtle speed, staring straight at him. Jason sighed, shaking his head. "Forget I said anything." Aisha swallowed, wiping her mouth with a napkin. "Not my fault the food is good and free. You rich people don't appreciate the luxury of free food." Jason smirked, setting his fork down. "Right, because having breakfast in a dining hall the size of a small airport is such a struggle." "Exactly," she replied smoothly, reaching for her juice. "Do you know how exhausting it must be to lift a fork in this room? By the time the food gets to your mouth, you've burned all the calories." Jason let out a small huff of laughter, shaking his head. "Most people in this house tiptoe around my father," he mused, resting his chin on his hand. "But you eat like you'd ask him for a raise while stealing the silverware." Aisha shrugged. "I mean, if you're going to commit a crime, at least get paid for it." Jason sighed. She was ridiculous. But he wasn't annoyed. If anything, he was intrigued. "So tell me," he asked, studying her carefully, "what else have you observed about me?" Aisha leaned back, tapping her chin. "Oh, where do I begin?" She pointed at his untouched plate. "You don't eat much. Either you overthink everything, or you secretly survive on air and spite." Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "What else?" She gestured at his perfectly folded napkin. "You're annoyingly neat, like scary neat. You probably arrange your socks by color, don't you?" Jason gave her a blank stare. "I don't see how that's relevant." Aisha smirked, sipping her juice. It's relevant because people who organize socks have control issues. You need everything a certain way, or it throws you off. Jason blinked. Was she analyzing him? Aisha leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just a fraction. And lastly, she narrowed her eyes, her voice dipping into something softer. You don't laugh properly. Jason froze for half a second, caught off guard. Excuse me? You smirk. You chuckle. You exhale sharply through your nose. But you don't really laugh. Not the kind of laugh that makes your stomach hurt. Jason picked up his glass of water, stalling. Maybe I just don't find things funny. Aisha raised an eyebrow, tilting her head. Or maybe you've spent too much time in this ice-cold mansion with your terrifying father and forgot how. Jason took a slow sip, his gaze never leaving hers. You're very nosy. Aisha grinned, grabbing another piece of toast. I prefer observant. And don't worry, I'll fix that laughter problem. Jason sighed, but a small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. She was going to be impossible to ignore, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind. The morning sunlight streamed through the massive windows, casting golden hues across the polished floors of the estate. The house was quiet, still waking up except for the occasional rustling of the staff preparing for the day. Aisha, on the other hand, was on a mission. She had a job to do, and Jason wasn't going to make her life easy. Walking through the long hallway toward his room, she rehearsed her usual approach. Light teasing, controlled curiosity, just enough to keep him from shutting her out completely. But as she pushed the door open, she walked straight into a wall of heat and muscle. Except it wasn't a wall. It was Jason, fresh out of the shower. Water clung to his broad chest, glistening under the soft morning light. Droplets sliding down the ridges of his toned abdomen before disappearing into the loose towel hanging dangerously low on his hips. His damp curls fell slightly over his forehead, and the steam from the bathroom still clung to his skin. Aisha's brain short-circuited. Jason's sharp gaze locked onto her, his expression unreadable, but his stance was tense, like he hadn't expected her either. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "Are you just going to stand there?" His voice was low, unimpressed, amused. Aisha gasped dramatically, turning away so fast she almost tripped over her own feet. "Oh my God," she yelped, hands flying to cover her face. "I swear I didn't know you were like this." Jason smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Like what?" "You know." She peeked between her fingers, her eyes darting back to his chest before snapping them shut again. "You could have at least warned me." "Warned you?" He let out a slow exhale, shaking his head. "This is my room." Aisha groaned, still refusing to look at him properly. "You could have locked the door. You could have knocked." Aisha hesitated. Fair point. Still, she wasn't about to lose this argument. She dropped her hands and squared her shoulders, forcing herself to act normal, which was difficult when he still looked like a scene out of a forbidden romance novel. "You act like I've never seen a man before," she muttered, rolling her eyes. Jason arched an eyebrow, grabbing a crisp black shirt from the dresser. "And have you?" Aisha opened her mouth, then closed it. Jason smirked. "Thought so," she scoffed, folding her arms. "For your information, I have seen plenty of shirtless men, but not ones you work for." He pulled the shirt over his head, his muscles flexing slightly as he buttoned it up with ease. Aisha blinked. "Number, not ones I work for." Jason chuckled, turning to the mirror to fix his cuffs. "Good to know I'm your first." Aisha gaped at him. "Excuse me?" He shrugged, completely unbothered, adjusting his collar like their conversation was nothing out of the ordinary. "You said it, not me." She was going to kill him. The evening air was cool, carrying the soft scent of blooming flowers as Jason and Aisha sat in the garden. The lanterns lining the stone pathways cast a warm golden glow, flickering gently in the breeze. The estate's gardens were beautiful, quiet, intimate, yet Jason had never truly spent time here, until tonight. And of course, she was here too. Aisha, no longer in the stiff, Maid uniform, but dressed in something casual, something comfortable, yet still effortlessly put together. It was different. She was different, and he noticed, but he didn't admire. That would be crossing a line. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, watching as she stretched out her legs, looking far too at ease for someone who worked for him. "So?" Jason mused, swirling the drink in his hand. "You finally listened." Aisha raised a brow, tilting her head. "Listened to what?" "About the uniform," he pointed out, gesturing to her. "You don't have to wear it. You're my personal maid, not a servant. You can dress into something nice. I don't want that feeling like you're my slave." Aisha's lips curved slightly, the glow of the lanterns making her eyes sparkle with mischief. "That almost sounded like concern, sir." Jason rolled his eyes. "Don't push it." She chuckled, shifting slightly, her movement fluid, confident. "You know," she said lightly, crossing one leg over the other, "if I didn't know any better, I'd say you actually care how I look." Jason gave her a flat look, taking a slow sip of his drink. "If you didn't know any better, you'd be wrong." Aisha smirked, leaning in just enough for him to catch the faintest trace of her perfume. "Well, lucky for me, I always know better." Jason exhaled, shaking his head, but he didn't pull away. Not yet. Aisha had a way of flirting professionally, something subtle yet intentional. Just enough to push boundaries without ever crossing them. The way she played with her bracelet absent-mindedly, her fingers occasionally brushing against his arm as she gestured during the conversation. It wasn't obvious, but it was there, and Jason felt it. Not in the way most men would. Not in admiration, not in desire, but in awareness. She was working for him, and he was keeping control. "You're quiet today," Aisha noted, tilting her head. "Thinking too much?" "Observing," Jason corrected smoothly. She hummed, tapping a finger against the wooden bench between them. "Let me guess. You're trying to figure me out." Jason smirked. "You're not that complicated." Aisha gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Wow, the audacity." Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "Tell me," she continued, eyes glinting, "what exactly have you figured out about me?" Jason leaned back slightly, arms folded, watching her. "You talk too much." Aisha laughed, the sound soft, almost melodic. "And you like it," she teased. Jason scoffed. "I tolerate it." "Mm-hmm." Aisha nodded knowingly, tapping her fingers against her knee. "And yet here we are, sitting together in a garden, talking, laughing. You didn't have to invite me, but you did." Jason held her gaze for a moment. She was right, and that was annoying. "I didn't invite you," he corrected, finishing the last sip of his drink. "You just never leave." Aisha grinned, shifting slightly so that their shoulders almost brushed. "And yet, you never tell me to go." Jason didn't respond immediately, because once again, she was right. But he wasn't going to admit that. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them for a moment longer, before standing up, adjusting his shirt. "It's late," he muttered. "Go inside before you catch a cold." Aisha smiled, stretching lazily as she stood up. "You know," she mused, her voice soft, teasing, "for someone who claims he's not interested, you sure do pay attention to me a lot." Jason sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're impossible." Aisha smirked, stepping past him, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm as she walked toward the house. "And you, dear Jason, are in denial." Jason didn't turn, didn't respond. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the lanterns flicker in the night breeze. She was dangerous, not because she was breaking any rules, but because she was making him want to. The city was alive with movement, the streets humming with laughter and flashing lights as Jason Williams leaned back against the leather seat of his sleek black Bentley. Beside him, Aisha sat with her legs crossed, the hem of her dress riding up slightly as she adjusted herself, her eyes twinkling under the neon city lights streaming through the car window. It wasn't planned, not exactly, but somehow he had taken her out tonight. He wasn't even sure why. She had casually suggested it earlier in the day, and before he could think of a reason to decline, she had already decided for both of them. Now here they were, leaving a bar, her tipsy giggles filling the car, his sharp mind working double to keep his composure. Jason wasn't the kind of man to drink recklessly, and he certainly wasn't the kind to let his guard down around women like her. And yet, Aisha had a way of pulling him in. "You're staring at me again." Jason didn't look away from the road as he drove, but he didn't deny it either. "Maybe I just like to assess my surroundings," he muttered. Aisha sighed dramatically, leaning her head back against the seat. "God, you are exhausting. And you are drunk." "I am not." She turned her head sharply, looking at him with an exaggerated pout. Jason let out a low chuckle. "You are. And you're ridiculous. You like it." "No, I tolerate it." Aisha rolled her eyes, waving a hand dismissively. "Jason, I have a very serious question." Jason arched a brow. "I doubt that." "Shh," she scolded, placing a finger over his lips before giggling and retracting it. "Listen, do you," she hiccuped, giggling again, "find me attractive?" Jason's grip tightened on the steering wheel for half a second, but he kept his expression neutral. "You ask a lot of unnecessary questions." "That's not an answer," she teased, tilting her head. Jason sighed, exhaling slowly through his nose. "You already know you're attractive, Aisha," she gasped, placing a hand over her chest dramatically. "Oh my God, did you just admit it?" Jason smirked. "I simply stated a fact. And yet, you don't act like it." Jason finally turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Aisha licked her lips slowly, leaning in just a fraction closer. "Most men would have kissed me by now." Jason chuckled darkly. "I am not most men." "Oh, believe me, I know." She leaned in even closer, her breath warm against his skin as she whispered, "But you are still a man." Jason's jaw clenched. She was testing him. She knew exactly what she was doing, but he wasn't the type to fall so easily. He exhaled slowly. "And you," he murmured, "are incredibly intoxicated." Aisha giggled, shaking her head. "Barely." "Enough." A slow, lazy smile spread across her lips. "So, if I weren't drunk, would you?" Jason didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he wasn't sure. By the time they arrived back at the estate, Aisha was officially out of it. Jason stepped out first, rounding the car to her side, opening the door before she could stumble out on her own. "Come on, trouble," he muttered, reaching for her. Aisha leaned into him without hesitation, wrapping her arms loosely around his neck as he scooped her up effortlessly. "Oh," she mused, her cheek pressing against his chest. "You smell expensive." Jason sighed. "Because I am." She laughed, the sound soft, light, and entirely unguarded. He carried her through the house, past the silent halls and dimly lit corridors, straight to his room. He could have taken her to the guest wing, but for some reason he didn't. Not that he was going to do anything. That wasn't who he was. But still, something about the idea of leaving her alone in some unfamiliar room didn't sit well with him. Gently, he placed her onto his bed, pulling the blanket over her. She blinked up at him sleepily, a soft, lazy smirk tugging at her lips. "You're such a gentleman," she murmured, reaching up to brush her fingers over his jaw. Jason caught her wrist gently, his voice low, firm. "Go to sleep, Aisha." She pouted, studying his face in the dim light. "You know," she whispered, "I bet you're even more handsome when you let yourself smile properly." Jason exhaled slowly, removing her hand from his face. "And I bet you're even more dangerous when you're sober." She grinned sleepily, her eyes fluttering shut. "Guess we'll find out tomorrow." Jason shook his head, standing up and running a hand through his hair. She was a problem, a dangerous one. And yet, as he stood there, watching her breathe evenly, wrapped up in his bed, he knew he was already losing control. The estate was silent, except for the slow ticking of the antique clock on the wall. The dim glow from the bedside lamp cast soft shadows over Aisha's face as she lay there, staring at the ceiling, deep in thought. Jason had left the room, left her, left the opportunity. And now, for the first time, doubt slithered into her mind. She had thrown herself at him, practically invited him in, given him every single signal, and yet, nothing. Not even a hesitation. Was he really? Her fingers gripped the sheets as she sat up, a frown forming between her brows. Was he really gay? Because if he was, this game was going to be a whole lot harder. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her messy curls, her mind replaying every moment from the night. The car ride, the teasing, the way his jaw clenched when she leaned in. There had been something there. She was sure of it. But now? Now she wasn't so sure. She had seen men resist before, but not like that. Not with such calculated control. If Jason Williams was gay, this would be an impossible mission. And if he wasn't, then what was he hiding? She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her teeth sinking into her lower lip. Either way, she had a problem. Don't forget to subscribe to support our growth. Your support will motivate us to drop part 2. The story is just getting started.